So I'd like to talk a little bit about 1Integrate's use within inside the utilities market. As I've mentioned previously, utilities is one of the three key verticals that we focus on within inside 1Spatial, and indeed it's been an incredibly fast-growing market for us within inside the UK and Irish market. And before we talk about some of the examples, I'd just like to talk just a little bit about the concept of the utilities market in the UK. So when we talk about utilities, we really mean water, gas and electric, but also we do cover the telecommunications marketplace within inside that as a banner, as a business, as a whole. Now, the interesting thing with the UK is that the utilities market is regulated by two key regulators, Ofgem and Ofwat. Ofgem for gas and electric and Ofwat for the water industry. And those regulators each year set out what their focus is going to be for the utilities organisations, and indeed what regulations those utility organisations need to adhere to. And it's quite an interesting scenario because in the UK there are league tables of performance of the utility organisations, and as you would expect there are some penalties and fines associated of where you finish in that particular league table. So actually Ofgem and Ofwat are very, very important organisations that the utility organisations adhere to. And actually, from my perspective as a consumer of utilities, Ofgem and Ofwat do a very, very good job because it's all about improving customer satisfaction and the service that is provided. Now, what that means for the utility organisations is they are very, very focused in terms of those regulations that are given out by Ofgem and Ofwat. So when we start working with utility organisations and understanding what their business drivers are, it's very clear that those primary business requirements are actually driven by those regulators. So as an example, something that's very prevalent at the moment is a focus on water leakage. So indeed, the average amount of water that is lost every year through leakage by a water company is around 20%. And that's pretty rare for an organisation to create a product and 20% of that product is just lost. It's quite a high percentage. So it's not surprising to understand that that is a major focus for water companies at the moment. It also means that those utility organisations are very data and application focused. So what can they do best with the data? What can they do best with applications that are going to help meet those regulations? And all of them are looking for smarter ways to use spatial data and spatial information to meet those regulations. And it's really nice actually because the utility organisations have very, very good innovation practices. They're always looking at ways to innovate the processes that they currently go through to have a more efficient business, to meet regulations handed out by Ofwat and Ofgem. And that's great for us as 1Spatial because we really enjoy getting involved with organisations at an early stage, looking at innovative ways of improving efficiency. And indeed, we get involved with hackathons and a number of proof of concepts with utility organisations that often then result in a project and actually a solution a couple of years down the road. So it's a really nice way that we're able to engage with our customers in this area. And of course, everything is focused on a return of investment with the utilities, again, which is great because it's good business practice that we enjoy and working with the organisations accordingly. So just to give a couple of examples of organisations we work with in the UK, the first is Northern Gas Networks, and we've done a number of projects with Northern Gas Networks, and the first was really about looking at the quality of their spatial information and how best then can they actually disseminate that information out to their workforce, and we use both 1Integrate and third-party technology GeoCortex to enable that. There are a couple of other areas that we're working with Northern Gas Networks. One is about the automatic generation of their schematic diagrams for the field, and most recently looking at their mobile workforce and enabling them to have better information on their Android tablets through a mobile application. So there are some of the examples of what we're doing with Northern Gas Network. It's probably a really good example of how we as 1Spatial work best with the customer, such that we have teams working on site with Northern Gas Network teams, and really it's one integrated workforce therefore when we're building these solutions. The other area that I just want to talk about is United Utilities and the NWL or NWG group, so Northumberland Water. Now, in both organisations, we had a similar project. There was a legislation change a couple of years ago with inside the UK, whereby the wastewater pipes or the ownership of the wastewater pipes changed. So originally, the wastewater pipes that would run through publicly owned land, for example roads, they would be owned by the water utility. But as soon as the pipe actually crosses, or the pipework crosses into an individual's personal property, it then became the responsibility of that individual. And actually that legislation changed such that the water utilities actually needed to take ownership for the entire wastewater network as opposed to those just in the public environment. And that of course caused a bit of a major headache for the water utility companies, simply because they didn't know where those assets were actually located. Now, with that, they're actually faced with a couple of options. Firstly, do they go out and actually survey all the areas and actually find the location of those new or missing assets which they now need to take responsibility for? Or was there a more innovative way that they could infer where those are, given existing data that was around? So we engaged with both organisations on a couple of projects to see, could we automatically, through the use of rules, infer where these missing pipes were actually located. And so we looked at utilising data such as the Ordnance Survey Master Maps data to understand where the property location is, demographic information such as number of people living within inside that household, number of bedrooms that house actually has, centerline information to know where the front and the back of the property are. And given that information and coupling it with the knowledge of actually the engineers within inside the utility, i.e. they'll know that if it's a 4-bedroom house there will be 2 wastewater pipes, we can actually start to build a series of rules that can infer where these wastewater pipes are actually located. And so we did that in a proof of concept, and when we actually went out to survey exactly where the pipes were, we noticed that, or we found that there was actually 83% accuracy in the pipe work that we had actually inferred against the actual survey work to see exactly where that's located. And actually for the utility organisations, that is a high enough accuracy whereby they can pass the regulators' requirements. Now, because of that, because we're able to automatically infer this information as opposed to needing to go out and actually survey that information, you can imagine there's a huge reduction in cost for those organisations and indeed time. So you can see on screen, and there's a sort of an 87% reduction against a 5-year budget for one of the organisations that we work with. So it's a good example in terms of how we can innovate utilising the rules engine and the spatial data and other data that exists already to give significant benefits and savings. In fact, with NWL, the final results meant that we had mapped an extra 13,500 private drains and sewers. And that's really important to them because they do actually receive a grant from the regulators for the amount or distance of pipe work that they do need to actually look after. So not only does it help them move up that league table I talked about earlier, but it also increases the grants that they're able to get into the utility because they have identified the increased amount of pipe work that they need to actually look after. So rather than just talk about it, I'm going to hand over to Chris, and Chris can actually demonstrate that pipe inference in a live presentation.
Thanks, Duncan. I'll just switch over now to our GeoCortex viewer. On the screen we have some utility data, and it's being shown inside a GeoCortex Essentials viewer. We have terraced houses, we have semi-detached houses, and we have detached houses on the screen. And as Duncan mentioned, what we need to do is to automatically connect the backs of the houses and the fronts of the houses to the pipes in the main roads respectively. And to do this we build a set of business rules that do this automatically for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call those rules via a workflow. So I click on I want to and I select run a workflow. I select the sewer inference, and I'm going to select the enhancement rules. And you can see that we've got section 24 missing assets. I'm going to go ahead and create these missing assets. So I'll click on OK. It then asks me the area that I wish to process. So I'm going to say the entire screen. And I click process area. The processing now takes the data and passes it to the 1Integrate business rules that are inside the Esri stack, and it's now processed those objects, and you can see the results there. So if I now press the finish button, you can see that we've now connected the fronts and the backs of the houses where required. So the fronts of the houses, this is where we're adding the clean water in, so we have a connection from the front of the house to the frontage of the property, and then a connection from the frontage of the property into the connection in the road. So the utility for clean water is responsible for the section that's in the road, and the owner of the house is responsible for the section that's in their property for clean water. For wastewater, here, the utility is responsible for the whole section of the pipe that runs from the back of the property to the sewer here. Now, you'll notice that we don't have connections at every single property for the sewer, and that's because several properties may run into a single sewer that's then put out into the main road section. And also, different rules are applied to different types of housing. So that, for example, we know if it's a terraced house built in the sort of early part of the 20th century, it's going to have certain pipe types and certain pipe diameters, whereas if it's a semi-detached house built in the mid-50s or mid-70s, then the connection details are going to be slightly different and the pipe types are going to be slightly different. And we can add all of those attributes in automatically as we go along. When we spoke to the people at the utility, it would take them 5 minutes per house, at a minimum, to create these connections. When we spoke to utility, they mentioned that it would take up to 15 minutes per house to make these connections. And you saw there how quickly we actually processed these objects. So that's another variant of the 1Integrate for ArcGIS stack being shown to generate inferred data on the screen.